We all use that word global. We all use that word. It's just got so many meanings. It's pregnant with so many meanings that you don't quite know what it really stands for. And if the definition and the words are changing, shouldn't you be thinking of what to call it then? Just to kind of do away with all that interpretation. It was a question we asked ourselves as we were kind of analyzing this research back in New York. And one thing we learned from collective wisdom across the world is perhaps there should be other words. And then we reached out to our network. We reached out to all the opinion leaders we talked to, CMOs, politicians, academics, and real people. And a lot of words came up out of that analysis. Some that rose to the surface were things like, let's just refer to the new globalization as universalization. I can't even say some of these words, you know. English is not my first language. I'm Indian, as you can see. Acculturation. I know what it means, but I never am able to say it correctly. Globalization. How many of us have heard that word? Right from the 80s, I remember hearing that word. Transnationalism. So many different words. And then finally, we came upon a word that we really liked. And it's like a legend. I don't quite know to this day, and I'm sure Rodney and I kind of agree sometimes, and we don't know, and we wonder, because there's no real answer to this, who came up with this word? Was it a consumer? Was it in a discussion? Where did it come up? But we came up with this word called globality. We liked it because it speaks to a new reality rather than a linear process where everything is just happening around you. And like Rodney said, if shallow globalization is dead, there is no room for shallow globality as well. We believe that brands are entering an era of deep globality, where if we're going to navigate this successfully, we have to have a deep cultural knowledge, a deep understanding of local networks, and a deep level of media savviness. And so, obviously, if we create a word, if we put something together, it's very important to explain it and define it. And I would like to take 3 seconds to exactly read this slide, because this is a big piece of our point of view. We define deep globality as the awareness of and the efforts to thoughtfully spread a brand, idea, or movement in a multi-market capacity while actively enriching the receiving culture. So if you notice, there is a fair exchange in the definition of deep globality, which brings me to the next point, that it is not an old world way of a one-way conversation. Again, I said this should not be surprising, of a push, of colonization, conquests, and just imposing yourself, and about ignoring the receiving culture. It's not the time you go to a country and say, America's best breakfast, and then everybody in that country who's never heard of it is expected to like it, buy it, and recommend it. That doesn't work. The new world is one where it's a bit of a dance. There's push and pull. You look for conversations. I love the third point. You don't look for absolute empirical evidence on everything. You look for pattern recognition. You see the signs and you move with it. So in the new world, there is a greater emphasis on your own wisdom and intuition as humans first and marketeers second. And most importantly, whatever we do has to enrich people who are receiving your brand and receiving your messages and receiving your gifts. There are 3 principles that our study has helped us identify that we can actually use to navigate this world successfully. Today, we will talk to you about these 3, but a caveat. We will talk to you about them in a very, very light capacity. Consider this as a trailer of a movie. We're going to talk to you about these 3 in about 20 minutes. And this is 30,000 people, 29 countries, so we can go into depth. If any of you are interested, we have workshops, tools, data to help understand each of these in greater detail. So, having said that, our 3 principles are: 1, create a globality framework; 2, find a way and establish a way to earn your way into culture; and 3rd, find ways to build creative stories that are designed to travel, that are designed to succeed and spread. Brings us to the first point, creating a globality framework. Ask yourself if you've ever seen the perfect design for a global organization. we asked ourselves that question. And when we did an internal audit and we sat down with CMOs, our own business leaders, our own key global strategists across the world and said, what are the clients that you work on? What are the business organizations that you've seen? CMOs, what companies do you respect and what companies do you hold in high regard? And how are their structures made and what do you see there? And there is no one structure. In fact, it is safe to say that every global design could be as unique as your own fingerprints. There is no one design. But what's common in all of them, we found, is there is a little pendulum of power. How much autonomy, how much freedom, how much autonomy versus authority, central versus decentral, global versus local. So there was always an exchange of power that was omnipresent in every single design that we saw. And so we believe that we need to have a framework. In order to be able to navigate this world clearly, and because there's no one setting, we felt that it needs to be almost like a graphic equalizer. You know, depending on the size of the room that you're listening to music in, you can change it up and down. Depending on how many people are in the room, you can change it up and down. It's kind of the same way in this global world, and we said, instead of bass, treble, balance, these are really the 5 factors that we've learned from our study. One is the category. Ask yourself, and think about just how local or global this category is. Is it a category where people appreciate global brands, or is it a category where people would much rather prefer local brands? Ask yourself about markets. What markets are we in? Are some of these markets more insular and protective, and in some of these markets, are they more receptive to global brands and to your ideology? We ask ourselves about the audiences that we're trying to engage with, the communities we're trying to engage with. Within a certain target audience, there can be communities that are quite reluctant to receive global messages and be part of global ideologies. And there can be some that are quite enthusiastic. There isn't a setting that's one. The fourth thing is we think about regulatory environments as we expand in countries and take it to markets where how regulatory restricted is the environment. Can you do things? Is it different for different portfolios? Is it different in different countries? And lastly, how are decisions made in the company? How do things get made? What is the creative culture? What is the decision-making culture in a company? And think about internal dynamics. For the purpose of today, we will only be talking about category. We will be talking very little about the audience and the markets. We will touch about those two as well.
So if we dive right into our category knob dial on the equalizer, one of the first things that we notice when we ask consumers in terms of their preferences in terms of local or global brands, we notice that there are particular category preferences. For instance, in the food and beverage category, our global consumers prefer, by and large, local brands. But then when it comes to technology, there's a large preference for global brands, where you have automotive and health and beauty somewhere in the middle. This might not be surprising, but particularly because food and beverage is something that's so intimately tied to our personal identity, to our self-expression, to our roots and tradition. Whereas technology is that category that's exposed us to the new world, that allows us opportunity and access to new democratic and egalitarian spaces. In Spain, this is no different. We see these category breakdowns in much the same way, so that you see food and beverage, large preference for local brands, technology, and actually much larger over-indexing of preference for global brands. But then we see a uniqueness in the Spanish market. Actually, when it comes to health and beauty, we see that there's an actually preference for global brands when it comes to health and beauty in Spain, unlike the rest of the world. So there are particularities in terms of category by market. Really, the question we want to ask ourselves is, do we understand the expectations that consumers have of our category? And are we meeting those expectations? Or are we transcending them? How might we add value to the category? Are we the exception to the rule of the particular category we're operating in? And if we're operating in a primarily localized category, like food, for instance, do you understand what the gift of our globality is? How are we activating that globality in terms of our relationship with local expectations? Then when it comes to audience, this is our third lever on the equalizer, we have, through cluster analysis, taken a whole set of data points that have allowed us to produce 5 distinct segments in terms of attitudes to globality and global brands. I want to begin with this first segment in the middle, the professional globalist. particularly because that's my category. I am the type of person that travels a lot for work. I have a lot of interest in global media culture. I'm pretty enthusiastic about global brands, but I also have some preferences for local brands. As you see, this is about 13% of our global population. If we come down to this end, this is the less positive attitude towards globalization and globality. We have somebody like the staunch localists. These are people who are really resistant to global brands as well as resistant to global media culture. They're probably people who don't travel very much, and they don't have that many stamps in their passport, and they probably live very close to home. On this far end, we have the armchair globalists. This is really one of the most interesting segments that we have. It's much younger. These are often millennials. And in fact, they're really enthusiastic about the opportunities that globality has to offer. They're also really enthusiastic about global brands and global media culture. We, in fact, find a huge over-indexing of this particular segment in the Spanish market. These are people who may not be able to travel a lot, but they do have a lot of enthusiasm for the opportunities and the access that globality has provided. Really interesting about this is that in terms of that over-indexing, and this is to refer to Harjot's point about pattern recognition, we find that the Spanish market is much more akin to markets like Nigeria, Brazil, Colombia, and the Philippines than it is in terms of being proximate to its markets in the rest of Europe, where there are a lot of over-indexing of professional globalists in the markets like France, UK, and Germany. So really interesting distinctions and ways of mapping patterns.
So really the question again becomes, there's no one setting, like we said. You know, I hope this gives you an idea about what the depth of that one pillar is.